um, through TAL. And I think those questions were circulated to you. Now we are very conscious that this is not what you're doing full time. You have many other things to do, but hopefully you grabbed a few minutes here and there to think about it. Yeah. So yeah, and that's something, maybe please give us ongoing feedback on that, where you feel that, yeah, you're not able to devote the time. We can always move things around a little bit, but it's good to know. Okay. With all that said, I'm just going to go back to where we were last time. Let me just begin my slides. And so today's format, we will take 3 hours, and I'll lead with the first half or a little beyond that. And then Dvitiya will start the first of a few sessions on the evaluation of design part. So kind of introduction to that. So that's going to be loosely speaking, the structure for today.
Okay.
Yeah.
Suraj, can I just point out before you begin? So on our conversations over WhatsApp, a couple of us were actually just thinking how, on the basis of the video and the reading, it was not possible to answer a lot of questions, especially in the latter 2 parts, which was the implementation and impact. So
that's fantastic. That means that you really gave it a shot. Yeah, we didn't. That's quite okay. The idea was just to put your mind to it, and yeah, we'll try to very systematically get to that. We'll take each of those questions, and I completely sympathize. The questions are far more expansive than the evidence in the material, for sure. Yeah. So, but it's good to hear. That means the way I interpret that is that means you really engaged with it. That was the purpose as a kind of initial thing. Yeah, I think you might need to give me the sharing screen option. I think it's disabled.
Please try now.
Yeah, thanks. All right, so I hope you can see. This is going back to some slides that we had discussed at least briefly last time. So just to remind you, since it's been a couple of weeks, we are very much in the introduction part, but we will be spending some time on evaluation of design, on evaluation of implementation, and evaluation of impact, right? So even though when we think evaluation, we often think implementation impact, as we will discuss later, we do believe that looking at design too is very crucial. I think one of you had asked that question or commented on it last time as well. I think Atanu, or somebody. So, and I think I just wanted to sort of remind you of these terms. We will keep coming back to these terms, but in this little diagram on the right here, right? So there is an ideation, right? We come up with an idea. We design some kind of intervention, and that leads to a set of inputs. Activities are a set of flows, right? On a daily or a weekly basis, a set of activities happen which lead to program outputs. And those program outputs in turn create a flow of social processes. Remember, we had a little bit of discussion on this term, social process. So all of those we'll come back to. The stuff in red is something we'll come back to, much later, sessions 9 through 12, to create some social outcome. So this color coding, I hope the color is coming through. The stuff in blue, ideation leading to design, and therefore program inputs, is the evaluation of design. And we have several aspects of design which we will discuss. Then the stuff in purple is how inputs are translated into the flow of activities which lead to a set of outputs. And then the stuff in red is how those program outputs lead to a flow, some kind of triggers in society. People start changing their practices, their behaviors, their beliefs, and some kind of outcome that we might value happens, right? So that's the idea. It's not always this linear, right? This is just a conceptual thing. Often we go back to drawing boards in the middle of implementation and so on, but that that's consistent with this conceptual way of looking at it. Yeah, and this is all just I'm guessing familiar with to you, even if you had not done it last time, but just as a quick reminder, we had done this slide also. Inputs to activities. So this is kind of the same thing as before, except here the point is that monitoring is typically the term used for the input to output kind of translation, right? Now, many people use terms like outcome monitoring and so on, right, to extent. But in a classic sense, in a conventional sense, monitoring is really about activities, the input to output kind of translation. And that's internal, as the slide is suggesting, internal to the implementing organization. That's very much within, if not fully, considerable amount of control of the organization. And the next leap from outputs to program outputs to social outcomes, that goes through the set of social processes, and that is outside the immediate control of the program. Right? Changes in practices, changes in beliefs, this might come, outside of the specific site of program delivery. That depends very much on many other things that the program has far less control of. Right? So that is the thing that we are calling impact evaluation. So impact evaluation loosely is the translation from output to outcome. How much is happening? How is it happening? What mediates it, right? Because in one particular context, the same output might produce one kind of outcome. In a different context, that same output might produce a different outcome, and so on. So that needs us to understand that social context more, right? So we'll come back to all this, but hopefully this is a kind of a simple, way of thinking about it, and most likely quite familiar to all of you already. Yeah. Before we go to all those questions, I just wanted to also quickly mention the similarity and the distinction between the terms M and E, right? Often we just say M&E, right? So they are connected, but there is some distinction as well. So this slide is just sort of taking us through something that I think most of you will be familiar with, but I'm still saying it anyway. Monitoring is fairly close to what we will call implementation evaluation of implementation, because it's really about the input to output translation, right? We can evaluate how that translation occurs, but we can also monitor it. So what's the distinction would be the question, because they are quite similar, because it's that space, the input to output space through activities, right? So this slide is sort of giving us three, things on which these two somewhat similar things differ. One is who conducts. Typically, monitoring, as you know, is done by the program staff themselves, all with good reason, just to see if things are happening as planned. Are there any red flags? Can we immediately intervene? And if there's some particular activity not happening, right? The usual kinds of things in program management. While the evaluation part is typically done by an outsider, or somebody with some distance from the program staff, because there is sometimes an advantage to that, to fresh pair of eyes rather than implementers also monitoring, right? So that's one distinction. The second is, as this slide suggests, timing. Monitoring is fairly ongoing, depending on the type of program, maybe a daily or a weekly, things like that. And nowadays we use MIS systems and so on, depending on the kind of program. While the evaluation of the input to output, right, of implementation is typically done at specific points rather than on an ongoing basis. And the third comes from the second. Because monitoring is ongoing, it's a set of indicators that get tracked. While when it comes to evaluation of implementation, one can ask a broader set of questions, as we will see from in a moment, the questions that you yourselves tried to think about in the context of TAL, right? And especially When it comes to evaluation of implementation, we can also ask questions of why, right? Why are there certain gaps and so on? Monitoring is more about just picking up the gaps rather than a deeper inquiry into what's happening. Yeah. So this said, there is still a lot of similarity in the general idea of monitoring and the idea of evaluation of implementation. But these are the three kind of distinctions. We can come back to this. So in a sense, one way to think about it is monitoring is really one aspect of the broader thing that we are calling evaluation. Right? I mean, that could be one way of looking at it. But from a program perspective, of course, monitoring is very important because we are doing activities. Immediate emphasis is on how are those activities, progressing, right? Are there some hiccups and so on? So sometimes it is emphasized separately, but otherwise we can think of it as one aspect of this kind of three-part evaluation. The evaluation of design, the evaluation of implementation, the evaluation of impact. Yeah. With all that said, let's now get to those three questions.
Suraj.
Yes.
Can I please interrupt you?
Yes, please.
If you can just, please go back to the slide once. So, in the very first part where we are saying that who conducts, monitoring is the program personnel and evaluation is typically independent outsider. You said that we need a fresh pair of eyes. So by that, do you mean, are you hinting towards bias?
Yeah, if by definition bias, if that's what we mean by bias, yes. Bias doesn't mean deliberate, right? I mean, if I do something on an ongoing basis, I may not be able to see it in a different way, right? Of course, the way I see it is useful. So monitoring, so it's not an either or. So yeah, if it depends on what we mean by bias. The sense in which I think you might mean it, you could say bias. But I think maybe a better way to put it would be just a different perspective. Yeah. Right. So, and that's true for evaluation as a whole, right? Even, some of the large organizations do have evaluation wings within them. The World Bank, UN Women, many of the UN organizations, the Planning Commission, I think, as I had mentioned last time. But even within those organizations, there is a distance created between the evaluation staff and the implementing staff.
Right.
For that intuitive reason that you want somebody who's at a distance to view it, because you already have the perspective of those who are doing it, right? That comes on a regular basis. So yeah, exactly. I think your intuition. I guess I was just hesitant on the word bias because the word bias, we think it's negative, right? There's something yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what we mean by that. Yeah. So yes, you could say bias or you could say perspective.
Avoiding subjectivity. It can be either way. I mean,
Yeah, fair enough. Now, of course, we can have a philosophical discussion on can you ever avoid subjectivity?
Yeah.
So, right, or at least giving a different kind of subjectivity, right? A different perspective. That's also subjective, perhaps, but it's not the subjectivity of the implementing organization.
Right.
Right. So I'm always hesitant with these terms, objective, subjective. So
Suraj, Atanu here.
yes.
So I think there is another perspective. It could be when we are talking about monitoring, it is basically we monitor the process and everything related with the process. But when we are talking about evaluation, that time we actually from the design to outcome, everything we take into consideration. So maybe a person from outsider, he will get a very fresh view, but a program personnel, he or she will actually not into account all the things which is involved in the process. So maybe
Right.
that also.
Yes.
Uh,
So I think Atanu, I was trying to say the same thing, but it's nice.
yeah.
That's what, I think you've expressed it nicely too. Yeah, I agree. I think that's what I also was. But do remember, when we say evaluation, at least for the purpose of this series of sessions, we mean that comprehensive evaluation, right? Which is all this stuff,
Yeah.
right? So what I was saying was, within these three, evaluating design, evaluating impact, the purple bit, the implementation, which Atanu is using the word process, right? I was using the word activity, converting inputs to outputs, right? So that's why I was just saying that the one part of the purple is similar to monitoring.
Right.
But so I think, Atanu, I at least find it useful to reserve the word evaluation for the comprehensive evaluation, and so evaluation design. So I think, uh, at least for the purpose of these sessions, if it would be useful to use that language, just to yeah, that's one. The other is, see, the word process in this whole literature, words are used slightly differently, or people mean slightly different things. Notice that in the slide I presented earlier, I was using the word process here, and here I was using the word activities, right? I think, Atanu, when you use the word process, you were meaning this, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So as long as we understand what we are doing,
Right.
but this is true generally in this kind of field, right? People use the word, so it's good to sort of just check what exactly does a particular usage mean. Yes. So the flow of activity. So and in order to avoid that confusion, that's why I was using different terms. These are both flows, right? The two arrows, purple arrows here, but one is a flow which is very much internal to the implementation process. The other is external to the implementation process, right? A point that I was making earlier. Yeah. So if possible, yeah, let's use the term process in this way. Yes, please go ahead.
Just a small question, because when you said, like, when it comes to evaluations, we need some sort of external person to avoid any sort of biasness, whether it's conscious or unconscious. So is there any term we have for a personal, those who come from outside, and their inability to see some of the contextual realities of the program? For the program personnel, we have a term biasness, but for external people, because there are many examples we face every day in our program or any other program, like when someone comes from outside and try to analyze things, most of the time they miss critical details because of the nature of the domain. So is there any term or explanation we have for that?
Yeah, first of all, you're raising an important point, Rakesh. Thanks. Right? And we will spend a bit of time later on this, right? The deep importance of context in order to understand anything of significance to a program, right? It doesn't mean outsiders can't do it, but you have to take a certain kind of effort and trouble, right? You can't just fly in and out and quickly try to, many things resist that. So I think you're making a good point, though. I'm not aware of any particular term, even the term you're saying, bias, right? To apply to, in the way Nani also was saying, to apply. I don't think that's standard use. These terms have lots of different meanings depending on the usage. So I don't know. I'll check with Dvitiya. Dvitiya, are there any more commonly used terms for what Rakesh is asking? I'm not aware.
No, I don't think so. And I don't think it's something that gets recognized also very much. This absence of context in an independent, so to speak, independent evaluation, right? So I think it comes from thinking that you need, the way that monitoring and evaluation kind of work hand in hand is that monitoring provides the context, right? And that needs to sort of feed into evaluation as well, for it to be like done fully. But I'm not sure. I don't think there is a term used to describe evaluators without context.
Yeah.
Actually, what Rakesh is saying, that is one thing for an outsider. And second thing, an outsider might come with preconceived
Of course.
notion also.
Yeah.
So that also not actually give the good result.
Yeah.
I think that's why Suraj was shying away from the word bias because it can exist anywhere.
No, but it can be something else that as outsider is a specialist in this field and he knows how to evaluate,
True.
which our internal team may not have. They come with very special skills of event. That is also, it
True.
can also work the other way.
I think that's a good, important point to recognize, right? So one is the fresh pair of eyes, not about bias, but a different perspective.
Yeah.
Sometimes distance gives you a certain way of understanding
Yes.
things, but also expertise of a certain sort. Expertise also, right? Different set of skills, certainly. I think Vaishali is also pointing to something like this in the chat box.
Yeah.
Right? I think, yeah. So we'll come back to this, I think, as a practical matter. And I think Rakesh's general point is, I think, touches a nerve with implementers, right? You have these outside people with all their so-called fancy techniques come in a short period of time. They claim, the kind of consultants. I mean, there's a certain stereotype that I'm also using here. Not fair, because there are outsiders and outsiders, right? And I think which is exactly what we're discussing. Some who bring lot of value, who take the trouble to understand the context. Yeah. But Rakesh, I will note this thing to see whether there's a term. I don't think, yeah, we are aware. Probably there isn't. Yeah. All right. So, with all that said, let's go to that series of questions. And the purpose here, as you know, we sort of slightly ran through these questions last time, right? So now we will take these questions a little more fully. So maybe I'll just read them out and sort of elaborate on the question, and then let's see what we can say from Tal perspective about the question. And as Naini said in your WhatsApp group, there was a bit of discussion on many of these things. Maybe you can't make too much progress. It's quite okay, right? It was just as a motivating device. So a set of questions on design here, then on implementation, and then on impact as the course is structured. On design, I think it's a reasonable question to know what was the idea, right? Why was there a need for an intervention? And believe it or not, oftentimes it is taken so much for granted that there is no elaborate, kind of discussion of this in program documents. Often there is, and often there isn't. But here, since we are sort of doing it a bit systematically in a comprehensive evaluation framework, let's raise this obvious question, right? What was the need, quote unquote, or problem for which was recognized and for which a certain intervention was designed, right? So as we use terms like needs assessment, needs analysis, and so on. So that this is sort of reason in terms of reason, logically a good first question to ask, right? The second is once some kind of need has been articulated, then so for example, one can say that, let us say the I don't know, girls attendance rates in a particular region is very, very poor, and we need, let's say we have some kind of benchmark close to 100% or something, and so that gap, the articulation of that gap between where the situation is, very low, very poor or uneven attendance, especially of girls, and some kind of goal of close to 100%. Articulation of that gap is what we call needs analysis, needs assessment, which that's something that we'll get to, which hopefully Dvitiya will start covering later today itself. The second question is, once we do that, why create a particular form of program, right? So if in fact we identify a huge gap between sustained attendance of girls and some ideal of 100%, there are many potential interventions, many potential activities, sets of activities, which can try to address that gap. So the second question is asking why a particular form, let us say some kind of Bal Sakhi kind of program, right? TAL kind of, or some kind of camps, or extra kind of support for particular students, to make sure they well, in the case of TAL, it's not attendance, it's about learning levels. But imagine some program which focuses to get girls into school. You could think of many other programs which could potentially address the same need. Hence the second question, right? A needs analysis does not imply a one-for-one mapping into a particular program. There could be several potential programs which could meet that need, and therefore this question. So maybe I'll just go through these 5 and then we'll come to TAL. The third is, how was the program expected to function? So often this goes under the term program theory. That is to say, suppose we come up with an intervention. We plan an intervention, a set of activities. So we're really talking about the input, activity, output part of that diagram, right? The program theory is really a way of explaining how the program takes inputs through a set of activities to lead to a certain output, right? So a statement of the logic between the input and activities to output is what is called a program theory, right? How is the program theoretically expected to deliver some output? The fourth question is how is the program expected to address the need? Remember, need is typically an outcome, right? Or girls are not in school, right? Or children are not learning, appropriate levels of language or mathematics, right? So these are all outcomes. So needs are almost always articulated as societal outcomes. So the fourth question here is, how is the program expected to address the need? So notice that questions 3 and 4 look somewhat similar. 3 is, how is the program expected to function? And 4 is, how is the program expected to address the need? They are, of course, connected, but by 3, the idea is to understand the input, activity, output logic. Remember, it's a theory. In reality, right, those activities may or may not lead to those outputs. That's for us to empirically ascertain. But program theory is about how it's expected to work. While the fourth, which is sometimes called theory of change, is how is the functioning of the program. That is to say, how are those activities producing outputs leading to some kind of social processes leading to social outcomes. So the theory of change is emphasizing the second part, output to outcome, right? Again, I want to emphasize that people use these terms in slightly different ways, okay? So, but what I'm saying is it's worth asking the question number 3, emphasizing the input to output theory, which we can call program theory, and the question 4, which is emphasizing the output to outcome logic or theory, right? Though typically a theory of change will include the whole thing, input to outcome, but it will emphasize the output to outcome part. So here I'm slightly overemphasizing it, just to make that, to say that both these are worth asking separately. Okay, but the point is the word theory is in both question 3 and question 4, right? They are both expectations. If done well, they should be done before the program even starts. Of course, you can tweak it as the program goes on, as you learn more. But the reason I'm emphasizing that is because how things actually occurred can be seen in retrospect. Yeah. Right? And that might, and then it would not be theory anymore. It would be empirically, how were inputs converted to outputs? How did outputs get converted to outcomes? Right, would be different. Hence the emphasis, because remember this slide, this part is about design, right? So hence just emphasizing the word theory in both, right? The program theory, theory of change. The fifth is asking who's doing this, who is coming up with the intervention, why, and there could be all kinds of motivations, right? This is where politics comes in, ideology comes in, social mindedness comes in, donors come in, or whatever. So just in order to evaluate design well, we should have a good sense of who's doing it and why. And perhaps, and this is a matter of value, perhaps we want to emphasize the participatory nature of design. So remember, if participation is a value, we can apply this value to all three aspects of evaluation, right? We can ask about participation in design. We can evaluate that. We can ask about participation in implementation. We can ask, we can evaluate that, and we can ask about participation in impact evaluation, right? In principle. So therefore, you will see some version of this fifth question in each of the three aspects of evaluation. So here we are talking design. So therefore, we are asking participation in design. Right? All right. So let me first check whether there are any clarifications about these questions, and then let's see where we could make any progress with TAL, just as a kind of motivation. So I hope these are a bit clear. I know I said it earlier, but do remember that terms are used slightly differently. It's just maybe I don't need to tell you. I think you're familiar with it. Even different donors might have slightly different, sense when they ask you to do a certain thing. So I am using these terms, program theory and theory of change, this particular manner for our current purpose alone, right? Sometimes people use the term program theory and theory of change a little bit interchangeably, right? So it doesn't quite matter. The point is, since there's a variety of uses, we just have to repeatedly be clear about what exactly we mean. Yeah, I know. I just wanted to sort of remind you. So let me pause there and check in with everybody in terms of clarification of these 5 design questions. And by the way, once we get into, after this introduction kind of session, when we get into evaluation design, we will try to go a little bit in depth into these questions, right? That's the idea. So yeah, any clarifications about these questions? Or for that matter, are there other questions about evaluation of design that you think should be added, which you think is missing from this? That's also would be worth thinking about. Okay, we'll come back to it if there are. Yeah, let's do the TAL thing, and I request Dvitya also to participate actively in this part. She knows TAL a lot more than I know that program. So let's take it through these 5 questions. Was there anything in the material you read? And remember, there is a lot of documentation of TAL, even though we've shared only a little bit, just for tractability reasons. Yeah, so for the first question, was there some kind of reflection on the need for some intervention, right? The form of intervention is the question 2, but just the need for something is wrong, is we are dissatisfied with some kind of social situation, some outcome, right? Because we think it should be different, right? That's the start of any kind of articulation of a need. So did you find anything of that sort in what you saw, even if it was incomplete? But was there an indication? That's the question of needs assessment, right? So yes, please, anybody wants to sort of chime in on this? Yes, please, Vaishali.
Yeah, so I think the problem is in the situation is that the learning outcomes for students and the subsequent lesson plans, they are designed around their ages and what they ought to know by those ages, like that age, instead of understanding what they actually know. And what this does is that it traps a majority of students in a learning stagnation, wherein, despite giving in those hours in class and school, they still don't, learn a lot. So yeah, that's the problem.
And the outcome part of what you said is that learning outcomes are low,
Hmm.
right? And I think you're sort of matching that with existing inputs or activities being not leading to it. But remember, ultimately, learning outcome is low is the issue, is the real problem, despite all the interventions, right? I think Seema has also written something like that. Yeah. Anybody else on this? And I think even in the short part of that clip of Rukmini Banerjee, the 15 minutes that we saw together in the last session, she said something like that, right? She indicated it at least. What Vaishali is pointing to, what Seema has also, I think, put down. Yeah, shall we move on to the second? Anybody else on this? In a sense, it's straightforward, the idea, right? It's just really articulating, look, there's a problem here. We want good, we are dissatisfied with levels of learning outcomes. That's it. That's a problem, right? And now we elaborate the problem. How bad is the learning level? Why is it such a problem? Where should we be, right? All of that. And once you put it all together, you get a kind of a sophisticated answer to this question. Good. I think we can move on. Dvitiya, please,
I just wanted to chime in actually. I wanted to break down what Vaishali said into two pieces. I think when you spoke about it, Vaishali, kind of brought them together. One piece being children are way behind where they're supposed to be at X particular grade, and B, the activities that they're given in the classroom are unfortunately not matching the level that they're at, but they're matching the class that they're at and the levels that they're supposed to be at. These are two different things, and it's kind of important to understand what is, when you're thinking need is the outcome, what is it that you want to address, right? So what you want to address is that you want these children to do better in their learning outcome, right? And how you do it, that, what activities you use, what is happening, there can be 100 different approaches.
And that's question number 2.
Exactly, right? So we need to, when you think about need, we need to really focus on what is the outcome sort of gap, right?
Yeah, but I think it's very natural for us when we articulate needs gap to link it with abhi kya ho raha hai, and wo satisfactory nahi hai, right? So we sort of naturally gravitate to saying ki abhi jo ho raha hai, regular classroom nahi chalega.
It's a practitioner's brain, definitely.
Yeah, which is why I think Dvitiya is saying that distinction. Yeah. Okay. So then moving on, and we can revisit these questions if somebody has something to add. But let's. So the second is
another. I just want to add that there is a huge variation in learning level. That was also a problem indicated in the study. So
now, why is that a problem?
Because they addressed this as a problem while they are giving the thing, which is not a problem while teachers are able to handle multi level, but there it is considered as a problem. And
thanks. Yeah, and the reason I'm asking is, see, it partly depends on where we stand, right? Suppose I say some people need to learn more and some people need to learn less, and those learning outcomes are okay. It's okay. Now, not that I'm in favor of some kind of deliberate inequality, but the point is we have to articulate, right? If we feel everybody needs to have a certain learning outcome, but they're all in different places, then it's a problem, right? So underlying it is some kind of value, right, about how much learning is appropriate, right? And whether equality of those learning outcomes, these are all values that we impose, right? When we say there's a problem, right? Problems are constructed, right? So yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I think it's a good point. Yeah. All right. The second is why create or choose this particular form of program, right? And I think even from our presentation last session, and also if you saw the reading, or if you read other things around TAL, we know that it took a particular form, right? Those intense camps, as well as learning support inside classrooms, but in particular ways, right? To kind of supplement, complement regular activity, not substitute for classroom activity, right? So there's a particular, let's say two sets of programs, right? The learning camp thing and the Bal Sakhi idea, the in-class targeted support kind of thing. So, so the question, the evaluation question for this aspect of design is, why choose this form? And in fact, TAL does a particularly good job of this, right? Because their whole USB is to say, this form works well. Because everybody's concerned about learning this thing. And look, we've got a good model, right? So they take pains to show why this, right? So now the question is, from what we've looked at, what answers can we provide? How do they justify this particular, let's say, this two-part camp plus Bal Sakhi form of program?
So do we expect a comparative year as an answer to this? Then these are the 4 or 5 different ways in which this need can be addressed.
Yeah, so it's a good point Seema is raising, right? Do we try to answer this by kind of taking a universe of possible solutions for this need and then saying, look, this particular form, is better or somehow is desirable for such and such reason, right? Justifying this. That could be one. Of course, that you cannot ever do this perfectly, right? How do you generate the full set of possible programs that's not possible, but yeah, maybe as a practical matter, survey, oh look, these are the kinds of interventions which have been try to categorize it. And that's often now you will find in the literature, the evaluation literature, that and I don't know, Prithia can add to this, but my sense is that it's hard to really justify program choice. People sort of say, yeah, we do this because we found it works, or some kind of idea that, look, the logic of this makes sense, intense camp or this or that. But I think Seema is asking a good question. How do we know that something else is not even better, right? Then we will have to generate, oh, look, there have been 10 general categories of interventions that have been tried out, then do some kind of exhaustive, number 1 may, number 2 may, number 3 may. It can become a whole kind of sadly academic project in itself. So I think we need some kind of maybe sensible way. But I would just say, and I'll turn it over to Ditya, but I would just say, Seema, I think the spirit is that to somehow say that, look, this particular form works well. It implies it works sort of better than many others. Suppose it works well, but out of 10, it's the least. Then it's sort of silly to say it works well, right? When 9 work even better. So I think the implication is it works a little better. Yeah, Ditya.
Can I just say something here? I mean, just an idea, but maybe, teaching at the right level. So how they have chosen to define the right level, that is the level at which the child is. So in this particular program, how they approached it was, they first, assess the children, and then they group the children, not on grade, but based on that level. And then they chose to attack the problem. So I think somewhere the answer to it also lies in how they defined the right level, that particular thing.
I think,
Yeah. So
sorry,
according to me, actually, there is other points also that they want to take and कुछ लेना, सॉरी मैं हिंदी में बोल रहा था, कुछ उसको भी नजर रखना चाहते थे ड्यूरिंग दिस प्रोजेक्ट एक्चुअली, that the daily classroom में जो ट्रांजैक्शन हो रहा था, that they don't want to hamper. So because of that, they only take the 60 days or 80 days, whatever, for the government or for the direct basics चीजें में, that camp or that will help the whatever child are left behind, they can address, but addressed by some extra classes like that. So they not want to hamper the daily classroom transaction, as well as they want to keep them at that level, what is expected from that.
Dvitya, can I just quickly respond to Science particular one, but I think you can give a more elaborate, which is, I think is interesting, Science, what you're saying, right? So there's some kind of pragmatism, right? So there's some reason why they decide to not disturb the regular flow of classes, right? And make their intervention around that rather than substituting that, right? Now, I feel that should go into the answer to question 2. Why choose that particular form? Why could they not also have said कि नहीं other classes हम थोड़ा इसको हटा देंगे, उस class time में कुछ और करेंगे, right? They could have. They chose not to. They chose to leave it. So therefore, we can ask, why did they choose to, exactly what you're saying, leave that and work around it? Was that a political choice? You don't want, right? There are many, there could be a lot of pragmatic reasons, not just pedagogic reasons to do that, right? But whatever the reason is, I think that belongs as an answer to 2. Yeah.
I think what broadly, I think what I wanted to say was when they started implementing TAL, there wasn't much thinking about this is the best way to do this, right? Now, 15 years of their implementing and evaluating alongside, they have modified the various components of the program to how it gets implemented in the more recent times, right? So I think, and this is something that Suraj said in the previous session, is that typically design revolves around what your strength is, right? And at that point, Pratham's strength was being able to assess because they started with Asar and their strength was to be able to assess what level this child is at. So the starting point of the intervention was, acha, we can do this correctly. So hame assess karna aata hai. Now, because we can assess, we can also group. And because we can group, what can you do in that context, right? So I think it started from thinking about what are our strengths only, and that isn't obviously the best way of thinking about program design, obviously, but typically that's how design often happens. And now, because of they've had evaluation happen alongside implementation for a decade, right? So now they know what works and what doesn't work in that particular RCT context. They have evidence, let's say, that this combination of activities works, right? And actually what Sayan was saying, originally they used to pull children out of the classroom. The children who were not at that classroom level, they used to pull them out and the Bal Sati would support outside the classroom. And then for whatever reason, because it was harder to administer, because there was, like Suraj was saying, this political reason, you can't pull children out of the classroom and let them lose out on what's happening in the class. It's discrimination, all of that. This program has evolved to what it looks like now, right? So they have tried various things, and while some programs have the opportunity to try like this, not everybody does, right? Sometimes if it doesn't work after 3 years, you may not get funded to try it again for the next 3 years. So I think, but it is important to think about what are the various options to address a particular need and not think about it from hum kya kar sakte hain, and then think about design from there as a basis of tackling the problem, right? Yeah, I think that's essentially what I wanted to say.
Yeah, thanks, Dutya. So I think there's a lot of interesting things already, and we are only at question 2. And for me, what's interesting is that typically this comes after the fact, right? We come up with an idea and we have some justification for it and we go with it. It's very hard to create this kind of universe of possibilities and prove one is better before we go, right? That said, at higher levels, right? So for example, when you think of big policy rather than program, remember we try to make that distinction in project, program, policy. This is attempted, which is different potential policy paths, right? And what would happen, and then choose which path. And the general term for that is policy analysis. The term policy analysis is a term used in policy studies. It's a kind of usual kind of course in any public policy program, policy analysis. What they mean is it's a forward-looking activity. That if we take this particular policy path, how will it be, right? If we take this, if we take that, they identify 3-4 potential paths based on political feasibility, and then they kind of see what are the costs and benefits of, or whatever, right? But at a program level, this is quite cumbersome. And we might do it, but after the fact, as Ditya is saying, right? When you look back and then compare. Yeah. So something for all of you to think about for programs you're doing or designing, right? How did you, I mean, was there even implicitly, right? I mean, we are talking about very, very explicit structurally, oh, I'll look at program 1, program 2, but just intuitively, do you sort of have a sense of, oh, different possible things, and how do you make that choice, and how do you justify that choice? Often, like it's just, yeah, that's what I do. I'm into training, so my intervention will be training, right? That's what I'm good at, kind of thing, rather than, oh, there are several possibilities and so on, right? Yeah. Okay.
So maybe the idea being backed by literature would also fall into this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah.
Exactly. Literature on different programmatic paths, right? Yeah. Okay, let's come to questions 3 and then 4, which is the theory question of how is it expected to work, right? The first of those, the question 3 is how is the input to output expected to work? If you do these kinds of activities, then we'll get this kind of output. That's the third question. And the fourth is, if you do these kinds of get these kinds of outputs, then you will get these kinds of outcomes, right? Was there anything at all? And of course, we didn't give you enough material for us to create a full kind of answer to this. But yeah, but was there a few grains of this in what we read? Let's take 3 first, which is the input to output part. I guess the question is, what are the outputs? And then we'll see. So what were the program outputs in TAL? And then, of course, for question 4, what are the program outcome, social outcomes? Or just, let's say, outcomes in TAL. So let's first identify that, and then we'll see what was the theory to get to them. So yeah, anybody, what were the outputs? This is language which I guess you have to be familiar with, because that's what you do proposals and everything. I think as a practitioner, this is language you have to use, I know. Yeah, so what were the outputs for TAL? Let's say, what's the one major output?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Naini, did you have something? Or Seema, improved foundational skills. Is that an output? Is that an outcome?
I would say, like, based on my understanding, so first is the basic assessment for grades 3, 4, and 5. And based on that, they provide them tailored learning materials, and instructors teach them at their existing level. And then one of the outputs is that, the children, they move to the next grade, the next level of foundational learning and numeracy. So that is the chain that I saw in TAL.
Yes. So yes. So let's go back to what Naini said. So if you think that, I mean, let's keep it simple and say camps plus Bal Sakhi, right? That thing. So the running of a camp, right? So many camps were run, so many kids attended, so much material was covered, right? So many, let us say, session hours were conducted. So those are all outputs, right? Those are outputs of the camp. Bal Sakhi outputs would be so many sessions with Bal Sakhi, right? So those are outputs, trainings, all this. Outcomes would be what Seema, I think, wrote in there, foundational skills, or what Naini, I think you used something like that. I think I forgot the words you used, right? So remember, outcome is what we finally want, right? Output is what the program delivers in order to trigger something. So imagine that you do a lot of these camps very well, right? Intense camps, get kids in, and they're, well conducted, good material, a lot of thought goes into all that. But somehow kids' learning outcomes don't improve. It's possible, right? Of course, then you'll be really puzzled, because your theory of change is what? That if you really deliver this well, right, then automatically the kids will improve, right? But the whole point is to separate the two and ask, how do you think that operating a good summer camp or having a good, well-trained Bal Sakhi who gets access to these kids and takes them over the things that they found difficult, the very targeted manner, right? Those are all outputs, right? Now, how does that translate into kids' outcome? And imagine that kid is having other troubles at home, right? Or has learning difficulties, right? Or like has, particularly, imagine that, let's say there are issues at home where the kid can't concentrate. Kid is coming to your summer camp, right? Is getting all this, but there are other things which might be affecting the kid's ability, right? To show those outputs translating into outcomes, right? It ought not to happen on a big scale. Then you really question, right, the quality of what you're delivering. But that's the kind of distinction we want to make, right? So the input to activity to output in TAL would be, the inputs would be what? Let's say for the camps will be all these trained staff, all the material, the location, the scheduling, right? The games, whatever it is, right? Inputs converted into various activities, so various sessions, all the things that happen, the flow, right, of each day in the camp, all of, right, leading to output, which is so many well-conducted sessions, so many sessions where certain kind of maths material was covered, right? All that is output, right? So,
I had a question. If we go back to the diagram, input via activities and delivering output, right? Will sessions, trainings, etc., not be activities?
Yes, the
outputs
trainings
would be
yeah.
Outputs would be the the trained Bal Sakhi,
exactly,
or the activities that or I would say the actual children activities that you are devising for
yes.
different levels.
Yes, absolutely. So,
yeah.
So one simple way, Seema, is, first of all, absolutely right. That's exactly how I am thinking about it too. So activity is the flow, output is a kind of whatever is opposite.
Concrete,
stock. It's a stock, right? That flow accumulates into a stock, right? So I do a set of, I take a class for many minutes, for an hour, and the output is 1 hour class done, right? That flow produces that's output stock.
But 1 hour class done, would you call it an output?
So that's up to us, right? As to how we want to define an output, I think that it depends, right? So it depends on how the program is conceived. Suppose we think that's a natural unit for that kind of, let's say, age group or whatever, right? However we want to sort of divide it, I would say it's completely up to us. This is much more in Dvitiya's territory, so please, Dvitiya.
I was just going to say, maybe we can just, it's just a question of language. Perhaps we could just word it slightly differently, Seema. So, in just using the same analogy that Suraj was, one hour of class, training being delivered is the activity, and X number of people who attended that session trained for 1 hour on X topic, that's the output, right?
Yeah.
There's a subtle difference between the two, but the activity essentially leads to the output. So when you've done the activity of training them for an hour, the output is that people have been trained for an hour, right? But the outcome should ideally be that they're better at something that they were trained for in that hour, but output doesn't necessarily equate to outcome, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that's the important thing, right? That's the theory of change part. So in the particular kind of example, yeah, please.
So basically, the outcome is just if you achieve the activity, achieve the objective or not. this portion will be good the outcomes part.
Correct.
And
Exactly.
we have trained all the teachers for 1 hour or 2 days, whatever. That will be our output, and input are all the activities and whatever the sessions we have done. So this is a clear difference. The achievement of the our training or not. This is will define far more from the output, I think.
Exactly. So since you've raised that, let me ask a kind of tricky question, right? Marks that children get in a test. Yeah. In the typical kind of situation where testing dete, right? I mean, paper dete hain, kuch likhte hain, theek hai, right? Think of a kind of typical government school scenario, not any kind of sophisticated other scenario. In that kind of thing, marks that kids get in a test, and ठीक है PTM में बताते हैं report card में ठीक है 80% मिल गया. Is that an output or an outcome?
It is an output. It is an output.
I would say it's an output.
It's not an outcome.
It's tricky, right? So it can be either, depending on how we interpret it. That's what I wanted to say.
Exactly.
So if Sayan can say in what sense is it an output, then Naini can say in what sense is it an outcome, because I think because it can be both. It depends. That's why I'm using this example. So Sayan, yeah, in what sense do you see it as an output?
Just one output, like suppose 10 questions is there and they have attended 8 questions or 10 questions, but have right answer up to 8. So just like that thing, it is an output thing. But just getting an answer.
But remember, output is the culmination of activities of the program, correct? So यहाँ पे क्या activities होंगे? ठीक है, कुछ class ले लिया teacher, कुछ right, got them to prepare, right, gave them some practice test or whatever, and give them some homework, this that, and then they score 80% on a test, right? So remember, output is the culmination of a set of flows, activity flows. So in that sense, Sayan, how is it an output? Because getting 80% is that a logical culmination of teaching a few, right? Taking 2-3 classes. In that sense, it's not.
No.
Right?
I'm a little confused now, Suraj. So suppose that, that's a monthly test, okay? Whatever the child has read through like an English textbook in that month, I'm assessing on that, okay? And the child scores 80%, right? So the inputs are those classes that the child has attended over that past 1 month. That is the input. Teachers' involvement, all the activities, they are the input, right? The test result, the test score is an output.
Outcome, you mean?
It's an output. No.
Output of what though? See, one is to say, as Vidya said for TAL, right? Output is कि so many hours, so many classes were taken, right? So many इतने सारे classes में attendance mark किया, ठीक है? Yes, इतने students attend किए, teacher ने attend किया, right? And copy book check कर लो तो हाँ ठीक है वो chapter हो गया, right? ये तो output है. That's output, right? Because that's the activity. But now testing, so in that sense, Naini, so we'll come back to how, in what sense it could be an output. But in the sense you're meaning it is what you're calling outcome. Because if we think that what the student is scoring on the test, 80%, is actually picking up some kind of learning level. If you think the marks are a reasonable proxy for learning, then it's an outcome, right? Now you might say there are better ways of measuring outcome, but I mean, this is the justification for tests, is that it is able to pick up outcome, right? It's a proxy. But
yeah, is a little tricky, right? Like output, outcome.
Yes, it's tricky because that's why I was saying, I was trying to give a kind of slightly shabby classroom picture and say usme, right? Right? So in the kind of typical whatever, I'm imagining, where it may not be a good proxy for learning outcome, because उन्होंने उसको रटा मार के हाँ prepare करके आप ये कर लो, right? Then it's an output, because you're sort of setting them up to do well. So आप दिखाते हो कि हाँ देखो आपके बच्चे ये कर रहे हैं. Especially kind of studies of private schools suggest that you have to show, right? You have to, right? So the reason it's tricky is, do we interpret marks as learning, which case it's an outcome, or as simply ठीक है some activity का part, which is sort of what Sayan was suggesting, right?
Actually, I would say this is purely outcome, because anyhow it is related with the learning. So ratta marke bhi sikhe ya na sikhe, that will be considered in the later stage as a outcome, as an outcome, because when we go for the whole class and their record, definitely it would be considered as a outcome.
I'm
So
not so sure, Atanu. So that's why I'm saying it's a matter of interpretation, right? If it is, kind of very cynical kind of mark giving, as then I would not, at least I would not call it an outcome. It's just set up, right? And we know many of the board exam results and all, TK, right? Political reasons. They change it. COVID they got everybody to pass and so on. I know at least the Rajasthan situation, I've been looking at it recently. So you can imagine scenarios, Atanu, this is my strong personal feeling, where it's not really picking up anything about student learning. Now, of course, we want to create baseline endline tests which actually pick up learning, right? That's what a lot of our intervention evaluations try to do. That's why I was at pains to try to describe a kind of slightly, shabby test situation, right? Which is sort of routine. Then I'm not convinced that that's actually picking up learning. Ratta Maro is not learning to me.
yeah, that's true. But when we will actually in this, I mean, in terms of data, you have to consider that is a outcome.
It's a matter of interpretation. There's nothing sacrosanct about these things, right? One has to make the case.
Yeah.
So you can make the case it's an outcome. You can make the case that this is very poor kind of, it's not picking up outcome, right? I mean, there's a technical term for this. It's called instrumentation threat to internal validity, fancy term. I mean, if you're interested, you can, meaning to say it's just, some instrument that you're using, which is actually not picking up what you want it to pick up, right?
This is really tricky, because how we get to know that वो बच्चा रट्टा मार के सीखा है, or when he or she gets the code, वो स्कोर जब उनको मिला है, कैसे हम बताएंगे वो रट्टा मार के किया है?
हाँ, I think that's a good question, and there's no easy answer. We have to know the context.
We have that particular score.
तो मैं आपसे पूछता हूं कि you do a very sophisticated intervention and you say कि 10th में board exam pass rate will be my proxy for outcome, right?
Yeah.
You might be that's not a good, right? Because a sophisticated intervention may not show up, because there are many ways to, pass in 10th without any sophistication, right? Right. So it may be a very poor indicator of what you're actually achieving. I'm taking this example because that happened in a program here in Udaipur, I'm right now, where we were evaluating. And it turns out the 10th board result for this particular program, it's called Shiksha Sambal program, it's a very poor indicator, because it's not picking up learning levels. The program is good. We know through other ways, but so I really think there is no universal answer, Atanu. It depends on how you interpret 10th board results. Turns out, especially in the last few years in Rajasthan, 10th board result is not a good proxy for anything much.
Okay, can I just add something here? So when I work with Asar sheets, so the first sheet was about letter recognition, then small words, then tiny paragraph, and then the big paragraph and the comprehension questions. So at times we would have children, not being able to read letters, but then we also had that spectrum of children who would read really well till the end of the paragraph, but they would not be able to answer those two comprehension questions. So ultimately, out of 60, their score would be 58, which tells you that this child has really aced the English, has scored really well on that test. But in my understanding, if the child could not answer both the comprehension questions, that means the child does not really understand the language. He can only, read. Matra
And I
ati.
think
So,
I think what's important, Nani, is what does that instrument test, right? And the ASER instrument tests reading, not comprehension, right? The ASER instrument is a test of literacy. It is not so much a test of comprehension, which is why they dedicate such few questions to comprehension. It's a test of literacy. So in that sense, this child is pretty good. Even if they didn't know the last two, if they're not able to answer the last two questions, literacy levels are as per expectation, right? They're only testing, can you recognize letters? Can you read things? Comprehension is a very small part of the test, which is part of what Suraj was saying before, is the instrument and what is it intending to measure is
right.
very important in you deciding, can I use this as a measurement of the outcome that I want to achieve? If our goal of the project was to see that children will be able to use the language, things like that, and you use the ASER instrument to test, it may not give you the full picture, right? So
Right.
that's the point that you are also making essentially, is that a core part of what I want to achieve is not happening, and yet this child is getting a high score, and so it appears as though program is working, right?
Hmm.
So I think this is a question of matching instrument to intervention, literally, to say, what did I want to achieve from this program, right? And there's just a small, like an incident came to mind with this whole output outcome thing that I wanted to share is, and this whole CCE fiasco was happening in schools. Teachers hated it. They didn't want to measure every 4 weeks something, right? So there was this large register that they had to fill about how many assessments they had conducted. So these assessments were just outputs. They put zero thought into what they were measuring, what that test was about, how the child did. They had to conduct that assessment. They had to give some grade to the child, and that's it. So it was no real, though in theory, I'm a strong supporter of measuring formatively, but in the way that this thing was implemented, it was a pure output. इतने टेस्ट किए इस साल में, right? Nothing more than that. And I think ultimately the one thing that they put effort into was the 3 or 2 summative assessments that they had to do. Those were the only ones that measured anything about the child's ability at all, right? So sometimes it's quite clear the difference between output and outcome when you use something as simple as a test. Sometimes it's not so clear. Like Atanu was saying, you don't know if they've by hearted and written, you don't know if they've been supported by teachers, in completing the test, things like that. But we have to be quite clear about what is it a measurement of what I hope this program's outcome would be. That's broadly what it should be.
That's the bottom line, right?
Yeah.
That's the need. That's the first
Correct.
question. What was the need?
Hmm.
If the need is to make kids read with understanding, but they're reading without understanding, which happens a lot with English, in many places, right? ठीक है, letters, thoda, right? Then we are not reaching the outcome, right? So
just one final clarification, please. So if we were trying to assess the literacy rates and we were using the ASER instrument, and if the child scored, say, 58 out of 60, so that would be an output. That would be an outcome. What would it be?
it would be a literacy outcome. It may
would
not be a comprehension outcome, is what Ditya is saying. Right now, literacy may itself be an outcome of interest. We want to make sure kids can read, even if they don't fully understand, right? So that's why I think specifying the outcome is important, right? It's not
So
just
we
one
keep
outcome.
going back to what we are trying to assess.
Exactly. So the theory of change ends, right, in the outcome, which was the solution to the need, which was the need that we identified in question 1, right? So it's the final thing. While the program theory is about the intermediate step, the output. In this sense, like I said, there are different usages. Yeah. Now, it turns out in TAL, if they did deliver the summer camps well, or they delivered the Bal Sakhi component well, then it's not a very sophisticated theory of change you need, right? It's sort of unless kids really have other things which are really distracting them, despite quality kind of program outputs, it's most likely to come in. But imagine things where you really need a lot of behavior change, right? Then the theory of change might really matter, because outputs may not, good quality outputs may not translate into outcomes. In the case of TAL, I would say it does, because it's fairly close, right? That output translates, because there are not too many steps between output and outcome. But you can imagine programs where there is, right? Where politics comes in, or especially when there are behavior changes involved, a change of practices involved, attitudinal changes are needed. That's when outputs and outcomes might diverge. Okay, and getting Fatal to the fifth question, was it appropriately participatory? The designing of the camp, right? The idea of the camp and the designing of the details of the camps, or the idea of the Bal Sakhi, where did it come from? Did it come in a participatory manner? How is the detailing, the logistics of the Bal Sakhi, and so on? Are these participatory or not is the question. I don't think you would have had much material, right, from what you read.
No, I don't think there.
No, that was a difficult question to answer, I think, for all of us, because first of all, like, participatory, was the program design participatory, or was the
the implementation is, remember the next slide. So it's still the idea, right? Remember, design here we mean pre-implemented, before rolling out, how they imagined it. Where did the idea come from? Did it come from some researchers or some people from outside that situation? And how did they design the camps, or design these, not just the idea, but the actual, how did they design the implementation, right? It's still before implementation. We're still talking about design. Who did this, right? My sense, Dvitiya, is it was not participatory, right?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It was completely like Pratham's idea, no?
Yeah.
And it was not shared while they're engaged teacher as a implementing agency. They're just telling them how they have to do it, but they are not considering them as a participator that in the process.
We'll see whether there was participation in other aspects, but here we are still at design. Yeah.
Actually, the word appropriately is also problematic. What do we mean by appropriately? Maybe if only the Pratham team, they design the program, they will say it is participatory. All the team members in Pratham, they actually participated in the program. But if we hint that appropriately means all the stakeholders, the teacher, government official, community members, everybody participate in the process of designing the program. So what do we mean by appropriately? That is also very important.
Nice point. So Atanu, for precisely the reason you're pointing out, we deliberately put that word in. Because if we don't have that, right? Exactly. So I think, thanks for bringing it up. Suppose we just said, was it participatory, right? Then you will ask the question, what do you mean by participatory, right? It's not that it's 0-1, right? Right? So we, by putting appropriately, we are forcing ourselves to say, in contextually, in terms of nature and degree, what do we mean by it, right? And that's important. because it's not that there is or there isn't participation, right? So maybe and what does full participation mean anyway, right? I mean, that's never clear, right? It has to be specified. Hence the use of the word appropriately. So as you said, so yeah, so that sort of forces us to to articulate what kind of participation there was, rather than just label it, ha participatory tha ya nahi tha, right? Hence that term. Yeah, thanks. All right. Yeah.
I have some clarification questions regarding this particular program actually. So may I ask?
Sure, I think that's a good idea, because we will anyway sort of come back to this program every now and then. So it's a good idea to, yeah.
Yeah. So one is in model 2, they actually, one is camp mode, and second is with the government teacher and in the schools. So in the second model, they actually uh, uh, the video, as well as in the document, they claimed that government officials, they will provide mentoring support. So who are these government officials? Uh, and do they have time to mentor these teachers? If yes, then how frequently they go to visit? Actually, they visit the school, and how and in which way they actually provide them mentoring support. So that is actually my question. Second one,
Sorry, can
second
I
one
answer
is.
that first? Can I answer that first?
Okay. I have a few more. So, okay,
Yeah. So
please.
I don't know if I will be able to remember all, so I'll just answer them one by one, I suppose. So in the context of I think Uttarakhand and Bihar, in both cases, these CRPs are the people who were trained on. So essentially, they were trained on the same activities that the government teachers had to do. There was an I can't remember the exact number of sessions, but there was an X number of sessions that they had to conduct in schools while they were being trained, so that they know exactly what the approach is, what the activities are, and things like that. And they were expected to come and support the teachers in case there was any challenge, because this was in this model, it was intended to be something that where Pratham was hands off almost after training was done, right? They were not going to be heavily into the implementation support as such, right? So that was, if that was, I mean, that is as much as I know about the answer to your question about who the officials were and what was their role.
Uh, Actually, in the video and again in the document, they claimed that it is a cost-effective model.
Right.
So, when we say cost-effective
Mhm.
compared to uh, any other program, or how we are defining cost-effective, and how we are claiming that this is a cost-effective model.
So there are various approaches of measuring cost effectiveness. I think part of it is what the outlay the to the government was, right? So if the government teachers are delivering the program and the CRPs are doing the mentoring, monitoring, support, then that essentially means there is no additional recruitment of people, right? So if you are hiring a Bal Saki, for example, to run this, then there is some, like, it was fairly minimum, some honorarium that needs to be paid. So if that setup has to scale, then there is an outlay that either the government has to find from somewhere, or Pratham has to find from somewhere, right? So in that context, anything that any program that uses already existing staff and just sort of changes their role slightly is considered one of the ways of measuring cost effectiveness.
And last one, how actually they thought that this initiative will be sustained after maybe if Pratham volunteers are not there.
Mhm.
So do they actually try to develop the Bal Sakhi and the volunteers for that? Or what is the sustainability plan? It is not clear in the, I mean, the document as well as in the video.
I think we'll probably share a document about scale up uh, short. I mean, maybe in the next couple of sessions when we start thinking implementation as opposed to design. But it was originally done, I mean, because it was done in this randomized controlled trial format, they typically start with very small, very tightly controlled implementation settings where the implementing organization does everything. And then you slowly sort of start giving up uh, activities or so that you embed these things in the system, right? So scale up was done very, very slowly for TAL actually. I think over about 5-6 years, I think it took them to say, let's hand this over to the government, right? And they still do obviously that Balsaki identification where that model is used, that identification process, their training process, the mentoring process is still managed to a certain extent by Pratham. But of course, they also implement a fully partnership with government approach where they only provide materials and training support, and everything else the government is expected to sort of uh, manage themselves. And that also came from them sort of getting buy-in from the government because the program worked well on smaller scale. They were able to convince them saying this will work if you can do XYZ things, you know. So that's broadly how they thought about scale up.
Okay. Trick. Okay.
Any had raised a hand. Yeah.
I'm afraid I'm regressing a little because the more we are talking about the distinction between output and outcome, I'm actually going back to the distinction between input and activity. So I feel that when an intervention is in place, we do have multiple inputs, we do have multiple activities, and as a result, we do have multiple outputs as well, right? So, in the case of TAL, would you say that the Balsakhi was an input or Balsakhi was an output? Like, in a sense, what I'm trying to get at is that the entire process of traversing from an input to an output may actually mean that something which is an output at stage 1 may become an input at stage 2, and this process goes on.
Absolutely, absolutely, right. So,
Yeah.
so remember, I mean, we just that diagram is just conceptual. Real world programs will have lots of loops, right? Outputs don't just convert to, I mean, inputs don't just convert to outputs. There are many things, and there are loops and multiple things converge. So absolutely, right? So when we take it to real world programs, we have to, but conceptually, what's happening is, yeah, you're putting in some money, you're recruiting some people, you're getting some space, you're getting some reading material, right? Those are your inputs. Now, those people use that reading material in a particular imaginative way with these kids. That's the activity, right? Those inputs then get permuted through activities, and the output would be itne good quality sessions hue hain Balsaki ke. You can measure it in hours or in classes, right? Or in number of kids covered, right? So whether you want to call Bal Sakhi as input or output, it really yeah, it depends, right?
Yeah.
If a Bal Sakhi is a person, okay, it's an input. But the output is so many Bal Sakhi sessions, right? Done. Now, there are many ways to measure that. One is the number of sessions. What is the number of hours, right? You might want to distinguish, oh, here are the language sessions, so many math sessions. You might want to just say total number of sessions. You might say, right? I mean, there are many ways, I think, to split that. So many one-on-one sessions, so many group sessions, right? So many sessions with worksheets, right? So much time spent on worksheets. So I think there are many ways, but those would all be outputs. And the hope is all those outputs put together. हमने worksheet भी किया, हमने one-on-one session भी किया, हमने maths वाला भी किया. All of that leads to learning levels are improving in a well-designed test. That's why if the test is kind of, one sort, then it's not outcome, as we were discussing. In a well-designed way of picking up learning outcome, all those outputs lead to one, right? So it's not that every output leads to a different outcome, right?
They converge.
They converge into the outcome, which is language learning or language skills improve, right? Or mathematical reasoning, right? Levels, right? Change. So yeah. So in fact, the interesting thing about TAL is these two big ones, Balsaki and Learning Camp, they could separately look at the impact of each of these in the outcome. But suppose they ran both together in one place, right? Then the fact that the kids' learning levels in maths are improving, we don't know ki kitna Balsaki se hua, kitna camp se hua. Right? But what they did is some places they did this, some places they did that, some places they staggered them. Right? So because of all the rigorous kinds of ways of evaluating, they were able to kind of say ki, right? So but if you don't stagger them or take them separate, then the outcome is an outcome of all those things, right?
Ceteris paribus is important.
Ceteris paribus, you could say, yeah, which is Latin for what, other things remaining the same, right? That kind of thing, yeah. So yeah, something like that. So now there might be situations where you might want to say, this set of activities I want to know ki iska kitna ye ho raha hai, versus theek hai, we'll do these things and together we expect, right? So that's up to kind of the program. That's why design matters, right? Which are the kinds of things we want to separately see ki iska karna hai, which are the ones which are together, right? Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, because it could be, for example, that if you do Balsaki sessions in mathematics, it might improve learning levels in language. Who knows, right? So now you have to specify some theory. Maybe engaging kids in maths might also, or the other way around, improve. Usually it's the other way around.
Language, quite a bit of evidence for that also, no?
Yes, exactly. So then what do? Do we say what's the outcome from the mathematical outcome from the language class? What is the mathematical outcome from the mathematics class, right? We may not need to do that. We just say, look, we are doing these and we are, right? So I think that really depends on our own need from the program as to which are the lines that we want to really sort of connect.
Yes.
Often we just want a kind of converged kind of connection, right? Because otherwise the pains you have to take for each of those may not be worth it. TAL is special because they did all these things. They kept experimenting in different places. Yeah. Shall we move on? I think we are sort of a little over halfway through today's session. Do we want a short break? Should we sort of ritualize it every time halfway through, or do you want to check in? Yeah, I think. What does everybody feel? I'm okay going on, or I'm okay stopping briefly.
Probably good, no? Like maybe we can start 6:15 again. Just
Shall we?
For people to get up and move.
Yeah, we're going a little slower than anticipated. So if people are okay, shall we just do the other two slides too? Then maybe if needed, we can take a break. Is that okay?
Yeah, fine.
Okay, thanks. Okay, then let's move to Rahul. Is the one who was championing the break last time, and he's not present today. So, so let's go to the questions on evaluation of implementation, right? So again, let's sort of quickly go through these questions and let's see what we can say from TAL, just from the material we've looked at. First, were planned activities mostly implemented, right? That's a kind of immediate question, right? You can't even begin to measure impact if in fact you didn't do much. So you want to sort of make sure that, what you planned got done. So you could call it, try to sort of gauge the extent of implementation gap. And then the next question obviously is what explains the gap? Us location mein to hum log mile hi nahi, right? We just couldn't recruit anybody. Bal Sakhi mile hi nahi, to us pure set of schools mein we couldn't really run it well. Yeah, we got one Bal Sakhi for 10 schools, to both diluted ho gaya hamara intervention, right? So identifying those gaps, the question is pretty straightforward, right? Measuring it may or may not be straightforward depending on the specific details and what explains the gaps, right? I think it's a very commonsensical, intuitive question to ask. Question 2, how do we actually know whether something was implemented, right? We typically use indicators, doesn't have to be quantitative always, but we find some proxy, right, to know whether certain things happen. हाँ, कितने class हुए, कितने attendance register देखो, कितना attendance था. These are all indicators, right? There could be other ones, right? So were the indicators appropriate? And that's important because Dvitiya gave an example of an inappropriate indicator, right? A test, a CCE test that teachers sort of cynically were running. That's an inappropriate indicator. There it's not implementation, that's about learning outcome there. So that again, pretty intuitive, right? This question. 3, how and why did activities change over time? This question is simply pointing to the fact that in any real world implementation, even in a fairly straightforward or simple kind of program, not a very complex program, things change, right? Program implementers themselves do tweaks, there might be big, more radical changes and so on. So did the activities change? How did they change? And what explains that change? Right? What was the justification for the change? That's the 3rd. So these are all sort of intuitive and right questions to ask to understand the process of implementation.
I think for the 3rd question, based on the table which was there in the PPT, so in one place they had the camps and the attendance rate was low. In the second column, I think that was Uttar Pradesh, and they adopted a mixed strategy for both. And in the 3rd, it was an either or. Either they were getting the learning materials or they were getting the camps, right? So yeah, that may be why, that may be an example of how the activities changed over time.
Yeah, so I think this is a good point. So we were meaning by this question for the program in that same context, right? अब 2 महीने हमने इसको ऐसे ही चलाया, तीसरे महीने हमने इसको थोड़ा we realize कि कुछ schools में we need 2 Bal Sakhis for every class, अभी, right? Whatever, right? So while the other is the program, they tried it in Bombay, then they tried it in different locations, right? They over time. So, right, I think you are pointing to that second. So we were meaning in the same location, same context, also over time the program can change, right?
Right.
That's the version we meant here. What you are saying is, okay, program ran one cycle in Bombay, they had some learnings, and then when they took it to Bihar, they tried a different version, and then whatever, then they took it to this, that. So that's across program cycles, right? So here we're talking about within a program cycle.
So iterations, basically.
Sorry?
Iterations.
Iterations. Yeah. So here it's not different iterations. It is within a program. Yeah, how did they iterate in that cycle itself?
Right.
Almost every program this happens, right? I mean, yeah. So that's what number 3 is asking. Number 4 is the participatory question. Who was involved in implementation? Why them? For example, is it locally, sort of, do they recruit locally? Do outsiders come? What combination? This is just good questions to get a background, right, of how the implementation worked. Was implementation participatory? I'm just asking it sort of on a routine basis. We just to make sure we ask it. In some cases, that question may not make too much sense also, but I'm just, if we think participation is a value, we should take it through all the three aspects of evaluation. That was the idea here. And fifth was, so do remember that monitoring is closest to evaluation of implementation, right? As we discussed a little earlier. So question 5 is about the monitoring, which is tracking and feedback from within the program, right? Was program monitoring satisfactory? Was monitoring appropriately participatory? Right? You can have participatory monitoring as well, right? So the idea of a Jan Sunwai, right? The kinds of things that the MKSS pioneered, and many people do it now, right? Especially for education, but in other domains too. You could say that's a Jan Sunwai, कि हमारा स्कूल चल रहा है कि नहीं, मिड डे मील का पैसा ठीक तरह से आया है कि नहीं, राइट? नहीं पिछले हफ्ते तो इन्होंने राइट ठीक तरह से दाल नहीं दिया, right? Whatever these, right? So if people come together, right, and question the BEO and so on, that kind of Jan Sunwai would be participatory monitoring. Or it could be within program, not necessarily participatory. You have 1 or 2 dedicated personnel with some MIS systems, getting data, putting it into some software. That's a more typical kind of program monitoring. So these are the implementation, the evaluation of implementation questions. Let's take them all together in the interest of time for Tal and just ask, anything from from the material you looked at. Regarding any of these. Oh, sorry, implementation. Yeah. So anybody, anything from Tal? And you may not have had much because I think there was a little more on design, a little more on impact. I think less on implementation, but still. Okay, that's one. The other is any clarifications regarding these questions. I hope you see that these are fairly intuitive. And I think as program implementers, you would probably be doing these. Maybe you may not use these terms and so on, but this is sort of so intuitive that, these often just happen when you think it through. Okay, so this one is going faster, the implementation part. When we come to this, I mean, once we come to each of these three sort of modules, you'll find that in implementation, a lot of the emphasis is rightly on indicators. Are we really getting indicators which show that output and especially quality of output? See, often we say, "Itne training hue, itne sessions hue," right? We gravitate often in our programs to indicators of output which are about quantity and not quality. Right? Itne sessions to hue, but itne sessions ke quality kya tha, right? That's also an output. And that's harder to kind of measure, especially quantitatively. Of course, you can quantitatively measure quality of output, but often, we just say attendance kitna tha, rather than how much engaged attendance was there, right? That's quality of attendance. That's harder to sort of pin down. So we'll come to these issues when we look at this in the second kind of module. All good? Are people quiet because in lieu of break, you're sort of getting tired? So I hope energy is not flagging. Shall I go on? Should I linger on this in case there's any comments or any Tal applications for these questions?
Pondering on the outcome of not giving a break.
Good one. Good one, Seema. To avoid the pondering, we should just take the break. Otherwise, you spend more time pondering than in actually doing the break. Let's do one thing. Let's do the next slide, and if needed, we'll take our break, right? Which is the final set of questions, the kind of third module. Remember, the world of impact or outcome is the world which is going from output, right? So very often the term impact is used. Now you might wonder, and you might know also, right? Is there a distinction between outcome and impact? Quite often these terms are used interchangeably. Again, that's why I'm saying, it depends on when a particular person uses it. The important distinction is between output on the one hand and outcome or impact on the other, right? That's the important distinction. Yeah, because at the end of the day, we don't care about output, right? Because that's not the need fulfillment, right? At the end of the day, we care about impact or outcome. Output is the program's journey to hopefully get to what we ultimately care about, right? Which is not ki itne sessions hue, right? We care about ki itna learning hua, right? So remember that. So that's the important distinction, right? Now, some people do make a distinction between output, outcome, and impact. Okay. So often in these sessions, I might also use these terms a little bit interchangeably. Like I said, many people do, some don't. So the people who do make a distinction, as many of you might be familiar, the distinction is that they think of a kind of upstream and downstream of an intervention. That is to say, ki the initial kind of change in society, right? It could be, right? Learning levels of kids are changing, right? The initial thing people call outcome, and those outcomes themselves trigger other changes. Hence, I'm saying downstream in the sense of time, right? Those sometimes are called impact. So, for example, आपने summer camp किया, आपने बाल सखी किया टाल में, and ठीक है, maths, yeah, whatever, some learning outcomes, learning levels changed, improved, right? Suppose we call that outcome. We could say, as a consequence, these children became more confident. They became more outgoing. They became more active. They took on some interesting projects, right? From all that, which was itself triggered by all this. That's downstream. So you could call that impact. Right? Like I said, some people make that distinction, some don't. Some just say all of that is outcome, but some might make that distinction, right? So, yeah. But those who do make that distinction say impact comes downstream of outcome. Of course, you could say impacts themselves could cascade, right? One could trigger further thing, and so on and so on, right? So you could, so in your theory of change, you could make it as sophisticated as you want in terms of this leads to this leads to that, even within the space of outcome. Yeah. So
maybe when an intervention brings about social change, for example, very layman example I'll give, that if the girl education rate actually increases, then we find that the child marriage rate goes down in a particular region.
Exactly.
It is not exactly something that the program was intending to achieve, but it did.
Yeah. So it doesn't matter whether it's intended or unintended, but that was the consequence, and therefore it counts. Right?
Yeah.
So when we come to impact evaluation, one of the things we'll discuss is its unintended consequences are also things, any change, whether or not, if it is unintended, it means your theory of change was not, right? Did not envisage it, that's all. But it's a reality if it changed. So exactly, I think that's a very good example, Nani. You could go one step downstream, right? Gender relations in society are changing. Attitudes to gender are changing. And so on and so on, right? I mean, you can think of many things, all triggered by that initial, okay, girls' attendance is improving. So you can imagine many kinds of things. So yeah, all of that would be exactly what you're saying. Yeah. So with that in mind, let's look at these questions. First is, what was the social impact? So again, so remember, I'm not now going to make a big distinction, or you could talk about cascading impacts or whatever, right? But point is, in the social space now, the things which we ultimately care about, what was the impact? Um, um, uh, unintended, we'll come to that in question 4.
Do we
what
also qualify impacts as positive, negative, or we should not at this point?
Yeah, at this stage, these are all sort of calls we take. I don't think there's any kind of formula or hard and fast on this. Typically what is done in impact evaluation is there's no negative, positive kind of labels attached. First, let's pick up what changes happen, which can be attributed to the program, right?
Okay.
So there's a kind of causality underlying this, right? I'm trying to not use the word causality too much, but we'll see that often, it's because of the program that certain things happen. How do we know it's because of the program? That's how all this RCT and certain kind of things come in. But now who's to say what's positive, negative? I think there's a lot of judgment needed, right? It's often not very easy. So I don't know. We couldn't. I don't think there's any hard and fast on it. But any which way, first we pin them down, and then we can say here are the desirable, here are the undesirable ones. Yeah. What were appropriate impact indicators used, right? So same with implementation. If ultimately we use proxies to pick up what we want, and so the indicators are really proxies of what we want, right? So we're putting this here because often we use this in a routine way, right? We just use test kar diya, right? This is a well validated test, so that's right. So this is just question is just for us to occasionally revisit that, right? And ask, are we using appropriate instruments? As Dvitiya had put it earlier, right? Okay, third, who was impacted? Who wasn't impacted? Why? These are all, I think, good questions to ask. So, for example, even in the Bal Sakhi program and the summer camp program, it's not that all kids, their learning levels improve in the same way. Some kids may not improve much. Some kids it does. So that's the question. Why? Right? Why is it working well in terms of, let us say, learning outcomes, however you measure it for some, but not others? I think these are important questions to ask. And there are terms for all this. We'll come to that. There's something called heterogeneity effect, which is that the same thing doesn't work in the same way in terms of outcomes for everybody, right? It's true for medicines too. We might both have a fever. We might both take a paracetamol, but it might work. It depends upon so many things, our metabolism and this and that and the other, right? So there is a essential heterogeneity in outcomes across units. And so that's what question 3 is getting at. 4, did the impact address the need, which was ostensibly the reason for creating the program, right? But we don't stop there, because the second part of question 4 is, were there unintended consequences? So what were the intended consequences, which is addressing the need, right? Addressing the need is intended, but unintended consequences are also consequences. Imagine, right, green revolution technology, it does address the need immediately in the mid 1960s of improving food production. But down the line, it created ecological problems. There were unintended consequences, right? That kind of thing. 5, how should we think of long-term impacts? So here I'm using the word long-term. Earlier I was saying downstream, right? And what is long-term, right? How long is long-term, right? I mean, these are all, these become practical questions because the timing of your impact evaluation then matters. Suppose you think you did a sophisticated intervention, and you imagine that it has some short-term, let us say, changes it brings in, but you think that it will take a while. So then we need to track it for as long as, that's why the theory of change again matters. The theory of change should be able to have a sense of that longer trajectory, right? Um, uh, I think somebody was asked, no, what was the impact of the French Revolution? And they said, it's too early to tell. It's only been 200 years, you know. So yeah, so it really depends on our own theory of how things work. That will guide us in terms of deciding on appropriate times to measure things. Number 6, what social processes actually occurred? Now, we are going to spend a fair bit of time on question 6. And so let me maybe take a couple of minutes to explain this. Maybe it's a little less intuitive than the others. So remember, so social processes, I'm trying to stick with this terminology to avoid confusion, right? Social processes, remember from that diagram, is the way in which the output to outcome kind of, right, change. So, suppose we say that हमने इतना output कर दिया, इससे इतना outcome change हुआ, right? And we have some RCT or some way of attributing the change in outcome to the program, right? We may still not know how it occurred. So the question of social processes is the question of how. How did the program bring about some change in outcome, right? Now, the theory of change is a theoretical statement of how outputs lead to outcome, but it's theoretical, as I said a while back as well. Here, question 6 is not a theoretical question. It's asking, how did it actually happen? Not how did you think it would happen? Not how did you think? What were you thinking about how it would happen? Right? That's the theoretical part. Here is the actual. So, like I said, in the case of the learning camp or Balsaki, maybe there's not too much of the how question there because it's, but you can imagine like the gender question that I think Nani you raised, right? There the hows become more complex because you're talking about behavioral change, you're talking about parents, this, that, these girls are attending school, but then many things will affect, right? So then context becomes important to understand where these kids come from, what are their neighborhoods, what are their families, what are the livelihoods of the parents, what are their so many things might affect the outcome. So less so in the case of TAL, I think, because of the nature of TAL. So yeah, and why, right? So this is really a very social context heavy question, and we will spend some time on this. Yeah, and question 7 is the participation question that we are just ensuring we put in. Is impact evaluation appropriately participatory? All right. So one question is, any clarifications regarding this set of questions? And then we'll get to TAL, because I think TAL does have something to say, the material on some of this. So any clarifications first? Okay, nice. Yeah. You can come back to it also. Yeah. What about TAL? Yes.
One clarification question. When we are talking about social processes, so how to actually identify the social processes? Is there any standard? I mean, the way through which we can actually identify the social processes?
Again, I think we are getting to really the heart of the matter, Atanu. Quick answer is there is none. Okay. And you wouldn't be surprised, right? It's not key. There's a menu of this thing. It's very contextual, right? And it needs a kind of anthropological eye, right? To understand what's happening. I mean, it's an art. That's one. Having said that, we do go back to the past, right? I mean, there is an understanding about past interventions, right? Of that part of that context where we are working in, right? Others have worked there. We can talk to them. right? And so on. So there is a kind of experience from the past that we can draw on, right, to identify potential processes. But we can never be sure. So I think always the need to be kind of open-ended. There is a technique called process tracing, and there's a technique called backward mapping. There are techniques to try to identify processes and figure out, right, how it works. We'll get to it at that point. But the short answer is there is no automatic thing. Some people make a distinction between the term mechanism and the term process. But I think let's wait on that. It's a whole thing in itself. But the short answer is no, there isn't.
Okay, thank you.
And by the way, I will also add, since that number 6 is, I feel, done less in evaluation, including in impact evaluation. The how is done far less than the how much impact. Often impact evaluation is about how much, kitna impact hua, ya kiske saath hua, not ki kaise hua. That's done less, and one of the reasons is it's subtle. There's no easy formulaic way of doing it. Yeah. All right. Any other? We can also simultaneously think about TAL now for these questions. The question 1 we've already covered for TAL, right? What was the impact or outcome? It was learning level, right? Learning levels, right? What are the impact indicators? They had tests, right? Well validated tests, which we think are good proxies, are picking up outcomes, right? Who was impacted, who wasn't? Why? Is there anything from that material for number 3?
I don't think in the material we share, no, but there was some heterogeneity, of course, but we can share more about that. Yeah.
Luckily, TAL is studied enough, because otherwise these are actually hard questions, and many evaluations don't really get to 3. But TAL has stuff on this, yeah, but not what we went through. What about unintended consequences? I don't think there was any. Did anybody spot any mention of unintended consequences? Not really, right? Yeah. What about the first part of question 4? Did the impact address the need? Okay, if you can read into that material, would you say by and large? Because that's how we pronounce kind of success, right? Often, colloquially. Did the impact address the need?
Yeah, I think there was a specific percentage of children whose learning levels had improved, and they had made that jump from one grade to grade level, or to the next grade, or to the next level, right? Next group, whatever.
Yes.
I'm confused.
Exactly. And they had quantified it.
Yeah, there was a quantification of that.
Yeah. So in a sense, there is material there for us to be able to try to, of course, it's an interpretive thing, right? I mean, we could disagree on our answer to this, but there is material for us to,
yeah, right,
to say something meaningful. Yeah. What about number 6, the social process business, which is how did the Bal Sakhi program translate into better outcomes? Like I said, in the case of this particular program, they're close enough that there's not going to be too much between the cup and the lip, there's not going to be too much gap. But was there anything on that? Or was it assumed that if you deliver all this well, automatically, of course, learning to badega hi?
I mean, I might be wrong, but one thing which was highlighted like at least 2 or 3 times in the post read was that some of these children are first generation learners and they don't have much learning support at home. So in that sense, by helping these children raise the learning outcomes of these children, but then what is the social process that happens here?
Yeah. Well, at least we could say is that suppose the kids did have support at home, then even if the intervention was weak, you might still get that kind of outcome, right? But here there is no other process at work. So we could even call the parents helping or not helping as a social process, right? Remember, by social, we only mean here in the specific sense of outside of the implementing program, right? That's all we mean. So Nani's example of parental support at home, parents being capable or just interested or whatever, right? Whatever, however, but they are kind of helping it along in, right? Now, the absence of that, right, is a social process, right? But that doesn't explain it. It doesn't need to, because the program itself was strong, well delivered. So in that sense, yeah, I agree with you, Nani. So that doesn't quite qualify. In principle, it could have qualified, right? Imagine if the program was a little weak. We didn't really deliver the camps well. Many kids missed the camp. Yeah, kuch confusion tha, whatever. Then we could say the program still managed to deliver because parents helped out at home, right? Then it becomes an important process to understand outcome. But here you don't need it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
like I'm getting increasingly confused with this term social processes, like say in academia, this would be a pretty heavy term that we would use. And over here, like by social processes, do we mean factors which the intervention did not directly target, but they were resultant? They were
They
resultant of
exist. Yeah,
intervention.
that's exactly right. I think Atanu or somebody had raised this, I think, last time too.
Last time.
So for now, let's drop the term social, if that helps, right?
Okay.
Processes. But as Naini said, these are things outside the control of the program. These are just there. The way parents are, the way gender works at home, the class, right? The way culture works, the way maybe this, whatever, right? Things which are outside, these are part of the context within which the program runs. But the program is not, it takes the context as given, is not changing that context. So it's outside the program, right?
Here we also
that's what we mean.
do we look at the repeatability or scalability of this? I mean, at a point where Pratham has withdrawn, say, from that town or from those schools, do we expect that the teachers will continue using that strategy of grouping and teaching at that level? And is that a social process which is a long-lived process?
It's a very neat possibility, Seema. I would not have thought of it, but now that you mention it, I would say, so I think linking it with question 5, long-term impacts, right? Suppose you deliver your program, right? And the program ends. Program has a certain expiry. The program ends. Program triggers some immediate changes, continues some change. It might, maybe others will come together, continue it, right? But the program can take some credit for it because it was all triggered. It all occurred downstream of the program. So certain processes which are very contextual, right, might kick in. So I think that's a good example of a possibility. That's a process because context generates something, right, which might sustain it. By the way, the opposite can happen too, right, Seema? Context might immediately kill it the moment you leave.
Yeah.
Right. Right. So that's why it's so contextual. It's outside the direct control of the program. Now let's put the word social back. So it's, if we don't put the thing, it's a little, so we are just putting it there to see the conversion of input to output. You could say that's also a process. In fact, a little earlier, Atanu had used the word process
Yeah.
for that. So here, by putting it there, it's just a way of reminding ourselves, these are things about the context within which the program runs, but which the program cannot affect, but which affects the program, right? So therefore, the term social is sort of the broadest way of handling it, right? The social, it could be what happens in the family is what's the relevant process. It could be what's happening in the classroom is the relevant process, right? Or the kids are getting bullied in the playground, and that's the relevant process, right? Which is affecting, or whatever. Right? So the kind of overarching term for all this, we're just saying social. That's all it means. Right? We don't mean kind of classic sociological thing alone. Anything about the context, yeah. I hope, Nani, that clarifies it. It's a little tricky, and we'll come to it only towards the end, right? We're going to take these up in the order in which we're presenting them, because there is a kind of logical thing. So yeah, I understand that it's a little, yeah. We'll come back to it. Let's say, right? Yeah, for sure. Now to Seema's question, should we take our break? We still have a good 45 minutes to go. Dvitiya, or what do you think? And so what we'll do now is, if you're done with this, and I'll let you to think about it for a minute or two, there are any kind of other comments on this set of thing, is we'll move to something that Dvitiya will lead now, to kind of talking about the first module, which is evaluation of design. So we'll move there, but I'll just check.
I think we may continue without having the break or anything.
Okay. Yeah, thanks.
But this is my personal opinion. Let's others also.
Sure. Yeah.
Tanu, sir, 5 minutes, please.
Yeah.
Okay.
That please was, I think it was a plea, so we need to. Let's do that. Let's. What's the time now? It's 6:46. 6:51, right? Something like that. Let's keep it to 5. And when we come back, Dvitiya will take us through the kind of the beginning of the design part.
Right.
All right, everybody. Let's do that. A bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just going to, so I'm on some sketchy internet. I'm going to try and share screen. Let's see what happens. Just 1 sec.
Vidya, are you facing issues with your internet? Okay.
Can you
Yeah.
see it? You can see it.
Yeah. It's
Okay.
clear.
Right. Okay, I think it's extremely useful that we did as much of what we did on, as much as the conversation that we had on design, because it leads nicely into needs assessment as part of evaluations, right? So essentially, I think in what we have in the next 30 minutes or so, we will just get introduced a little bit more to the idea of needs assessment. And through the session, obviously, some of this will spill over into our next, the next time we meet, which is next week, to talk about. So we will be talking about needs assessment and program choice, kind of. alongside the other, and which is exactly as it should be, because that's how I would typically think that you should think about program design, right? So just to that end, so essentially this is what we hope to be able to sort of be able to do at the end of this session, right? So first, I think, is the idea that we should articulate the importance of doing an assessment in program design and the role that it plays in designing a program. We should have some insight into how do you conduct a needs assessment, what are the options available to us, what are the approaches we may want to take based on how much time we have, what the resources are, what the context is. Then, of course, you decide what interventions are required for you to address the needs that you've identified, which is in thinking about what is the choice of program that's most appropriate in this context. And all of this will come from the perspective of applying evaluative thinking to everything, right? So when we think program design, we need to think about it from the perspective of evaluation, right? Because the course is taking the backdrop of the course will always remain evaluation, right? So these are the 4 key things we hope to cover in this session, some of it now, some of it later. And I actually wanted to send out a pre-read, but it seemed as though we'd already given you a heavy enough post-read from the previous session. So we decided to just I decided to just do it in the session itself. And I think that in that way, we also have the ability to answer questions while you were doing the read, right? But I think I would, instead of me sort of reading, I think it would be useful if we could have volunteers, right? So basically how this will work is I have the text in the presentation itself. So this is the introduction, like a section of the introduction of this paper called Remedying Education by Abhijit Banerjee and a bunch of other people, which was written in 2007. And this is maybe one of the first publications on TAL, right? So if I could just ask anybody to just read out the slide, it would be useful.
No.
Are there any volunteers, or I can just ask someone specifically to read?
And
Because
you can
there's
ask someone.
yeah,
Namrata
because there's
Ravat.
a few people we've not heard from at all during the session. So
Shall I?
please go
Yeah,
ahead.
please go ahead.
Remedying Education, Banerjee et al., 2007. The recent World Development Report on Making Services Work for Poor People, World Bank 2004, illustrates well the essential tension in the public conversation about primary education in developing countries. On the one hand, the report embraces the broad agreement, now enshrined in the Millennium Development Goals, that primary education should be universal. On the other hand, it describes in detail the dismal quality of the educational services that developing countries offer to the poor.
Sorry, give me 1 second. For some reason, I can't move to the next slide. Oh, there you go. Yeah.
For example, a 2005 India-wide survey on educational attainment found that 44% of the children aged 7 to 12 cannot read a basic paragraph, and a 50% cannot do simple subtraction, Pratham 2005, even though most are enrolled in school. Even in urban India, where widespread absenteeism by students and teachers is not an issue, the learning levels are very low. In Vadodara, a major Indian city and a site for the study in this paper, only 19.5% of the students enrolled in grade 3 can correctly answer questions testing grade 1 math competencies. In these conditions, policies that promote school enrollment may not promote learning. And indeed, the recent evidence suggests that many interventions which increase school participation do not improve test scores for the average student. Students often seem not to learn anything in the additional days that they spend at school. It is therefore clear that efforts to get children into school must be accompanied by significant improvements in the quality of schools that serve these children. The problem is that while we now know a reasonable amount about how to get children into school, much less is known about how to improve school quality in a cost-effective way. Worse still, a number of rigorous randomized evaluations have confirmed that spending more on resources like textbooks, flip charts, or additional teachers has no impact on children's test scores. These results have led to a general skepticism about the ability of interventions focusing on inputs to make a difference, echoing Henrich's 1986-95 earlier assessment for both the US and developing countries, and have led many, including the above mentioned World Development Report, to advocate more systemic reforms designed to change the incentives faced by teachers, parents, and children. It is not clear, however, that we know enough to entirely give up on inputs. Based on existing evidence, it remains possible that additional inputs actually can work, but only if they address specific unmet needs in the school. Ironically, the difficulty in improving the quality of education may in part be a byproduct of the success in getting more children to attend school. Neither the pedagogy nor the curriculum has been adapted to take into account the influx of children and their characteristics. Many of these children are first generation learners whose parents are not in the position to follow what is happening in school or react if their children fall behind.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So now, essentially, we have read a piece of text from this paper, which is the introduction, right? So it's setting the context of in what context was the teaching at the right level program sort of conceived of, right? So, and in reading this paragraph, um, what is our, let's try and, I'm trying to answer the first three, I'm trying to answer these three questions, right? First one being, what do we understand about the needs of the children that this program serves? From what we've read, can anyone tell me, or what do we know about the needs of these children that this program is supposed to serve? You also know a bunch more about the needs of these children in this program already. You can also use that knowledge, but it would be good to hear, what do you think the needs of these children are?
I think we've sort of covered it. So I think, yeah, it's.
Which is why I was hoping for super quick 1 second response, you know.
It's about the enrollment rates being pretty okay, but the learning outcomes being pretty poor.
Right.
And yeah.
Exactly that, right? So the bottom line of this is that the children are not, they're not at, their learning levels are not at the expected levels, right? The second question that is there here is, what what sources of information have they used in order to sort of try and find out what the needs of these children are. And the reason I'm
Yes, sir.
asking this question is because we would also have to think about what sources of information do we want to use when we are thinking about needs assessment, right?
The ESER reports
Yes. Anything else?
and their own assessments.
Sure. In this context, ASAR is Pratham's own
It's
assessment.
in the
right?
needs assessment context, it might not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So essentially, they have used, let's say, quote unquote, independent measure of learning levels of these children as the source of information, right? But they've also, okay, right. And then if you were the person in this situation, do we think any other information would be useful in terms of sort of collecting needs assessment for this? I mean, for doing a needs assessment for this community or for these children?
Do some
I think-
surveys or sampling and use some tools to really understand where they are.
Sorry, can you
I
say that
would,
again?
yeah, I would also say that I think Asar started taking the contextual information into account and their home environments into account at a very later stage.
Mhm.
Like the report that I can probably trace it back to is 2016. I might be wrong, but
Mhm.
that is the report where we saw a certain degree of discussion about the context in which these children live. So that is like helpful information in setting a context for the study overall also, and also to understand the needs of the children.
Right. So I think you raise an important point there because let's say that these children are, their learning levels are behind what is expected at that particular age, right? So that's a very it's an almost let's say it's a technical piece of information that you have, but there's also information which was there in this text that we read saying that they don't have support at home. These children may not have support at home. Also, that our curriculum, the way that enrollment has increased in schools in India, right? Because there was a huge push for getting everybody into school, that our focus as a state has been, let's get everyone enrolled, right? And in doing that, we haven't really thought about should the curriculum in any way change to accommodate the various different learning levels at which these children are joining school, right? So there is some sort of policy kind of placing of these children that has been done as well in this introduction that we read. And in addition, another thing that they have also sort of looked at is past literature on what has worked and what has not, right? There was some reference to giving putting more teachers in, giving textbooks, increasing the amount of time that children spend in school. XYZ things have not worked, right? And so this is almost forming the background in which they are looking at this particular need that these children are behind their expected learning levels, right? In the background of the fact that there are now more children in the school than we imagined, that these children may come from different backgrounds, as a result have different learning levels and different levels of support at home. We know that these children have lower learning levels, and we know that ABC things have not worked to rectify this problem, right? So it's important when you're doing a needs assessment to obviously identify the problem that you're trying to tackle, but also in what context is this a problem, right? Right. So this is definition. I hate definitions, but yeah. So essentially, it is us identifying, like needs assessment is a process of us identifying the gap between what the current situation is and what the desired situation is, right? So if you think about it in the context of TAL, there is only 19% of class 3 children who can read a simple paragraph, but maybe what you want is that everyone can do it, right? That would be the ideal desired condition, is that every child in class 3 is able to read a class 3 level paragraph, right? So, and it's important in the context of us being able to then identify what to improve. And because absolutely we all, I think, because all of you come from an implementation context, you know that resources are finite, right? You cannot solve all the problems that exist, even in the narrow space that we want to make a difference in. So you need to like really zero in on what the need is that you want to address. And as a result, you can direct your resources to identifying feasible solutions to address that particular need, right? So that's broadly what needs assessment does. We do it. I have my large part of my experience comes from implementation, from thinking design, from thinking implementation. So I know we tend to do it in more informal ways than formal ways, this whole idea of needs assessment. So I just wanted to check if you all can give me some examples of whether you've had any experience of actually conducting needs assessment, or how do you think of needs assessment in your organization as such, you know?
May I say something?
Sure, please.
Uh, Actually, sometimes the target group, maybe the needs, it is not their felt need. And as an organization, when we go for the need assessment, sometimes it seems that we are actually, this is kind of inducing need, not the felt need of the target group. And maybe in our design and maybe uh, uh, our process of need assessment is not very effective in that case. So how do we address these things? Like
Give me an
for
example.
particular for the teachers training, your capacity building program, when we talk with the, I mean the functionaries at the top level in the organization, they said something uh, else, and the teacher and the target group, their need is totally different, and sometimes it is not their felt need. So how to address this?
I think, sorry, just let me just uh, sort of recap what you've said so that I can make sure I've understood. What you're saying is in the example of, let's say we want to do a capacity building program for teachers, while the government, I mean, the officials may think that they do need it, the teachers feel like they don't need it. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly.
And is the way that we arrive
uh,
that,
yeah, just I am giving an example.
Mhm.
So maybe the I mean top level leadership in the education system, they are organizing an a workshop for uh, to prevent the corporal punishment. But the teachers believes they believe that it is necessary. Corporal punishment is necessary. Physical punishment is necessary in the school. So, but the actually department, they are saying that this workshop is needed. and it is sometime is the not real need of the teacher. So how to address this? Yeah.
Can I can I come in briefly?
Sure.
This
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
this is quite interesting. So one thing is, as Vidya was sort of emphasizing, need is regarding outcome, right? A social situation, desirable or conditions, right? I mean, as the slide says, gap between current and desired conditions, right? And this is outcome or impact, right? So when somebody says ki hame ye, we have had enough trainings, ye training nahi chahiye, right? um, uh, there, even though they might say use the word need, it's not the same as what we mean here, because it's not about impact or outcome conditions, right? Everybody says I need more money, I need more people, right? But that's not the need in a needs assessment. I just wanted to kind of clarify that, right? So when teachers say ki thoda corporal punishment chahiye, we don't want the workshop on corporal punishment. What exactly is the outcome, and is that connecting with this need? Because on a colloquial basis, most of what we say we need is either money or people, right? But that's not, that's really needing inputs. And that's not what a needs assessment is. Just wanted to clarify. Yeah.
Can I just give an example? So probably, suppose we are going to a state and there's a particular research problem, but there's not much evidence or not much studies which have happened on that. And we just dive into that situation. The first step would be needs assessment, right? The first step, say, to a community, if in case we are doing a focus group discussion with a few members of the community, and we basically are saying that why do you need this water pump in your community space? So that would be a needs assessment, right?
So if the community says ki hame water pump chahiye, right? That is actually not an outcome. What right? Now we can read into it and say ki what they really want is that they want more access to water or whatever, right? But people articulate it in terms of inputs or outputs, right? But a needs assessment. So, but as evaluators, we have to ask, why do you need the water pump? What really is your need from an outcome perspective? Because water pump is not a need. I mean, in this sense.
Yeah, I mean, that is just stupid.
Yeah. No, but what I'm saying is that's a typical way in which people say things, right? But we have to now unpack it and say, what is the we have to say, what is the hidden outcome that for which they are saying all these things? And that is what a needs assessment should center around.
Improved access to water.
Yeah. I mean, in the context also of what Atnu was saying, corporal punishment is some kind of means to what they want to achieve in the classroom, right? Like they don't just want to say, give me the permission to hit the child or whatever. Right? They assume that they want a classroom that's attentive, that's participating in the session, whatever. And then they may think this is one of the approaches to get there. As a result, they're saying, we need to do this, right? This is a thing. So we don't need a training that tells us not to do it. But the actual need may be that you create a training that engages, that trains teachers to engage children in a way that they don't even need it, right? So the underlying need is not corporal punishment or not, I think that's the key sort of message is, why did we arrive at this situation where we've already thought about this training for teachers against corporal punishment being our program intervention, right? We have arrived here by thinking that what was the need that we articulated to ourselves when we came to say this is the intervention we want to, this is the intervention that will help, right? I think which is why I was asking, how do we think about needs assessment? And this is it's a very practical problem, because often as implementers we are presented with situations where they say acha yahan jaake program karo, right? And then you have to think about what do I do there, right? Which is why I was asking, how do you think about what needs to be done in this particular context, in this particular set of schools, with this particular age group? What needs to be done, right? Does that make sense?
Vidya, I think Namrata has a question.
Yeah, Namrata.
Yeah, hi Vidya. So actually, I raised hand a little earlier where we were talking about the
Go ahead.
example. So I was thinking of sharing an example and then a question. So
Sure.
currently, we are conducting a scoping study
Okay.
in two of our locations.
Mhm.
So first of all, when we talk about needs assessment, so
Right.
there are certain methods that are there that we are often using. One is needs assessment, the other one is scoping study, and the third one is feasibility study, as Atunda has
Right.
also mentioned in the chat box.
Right.
So how do we differentiate between all three is my first question. The second is, when we are talking about the needs assessment, whose needs are we addressing here? Are we talking about the need of the program, the need of people, or the need to reach to the ideal level that we are planning on? That is one thing. And because currently when we are talking about our scoping study, we are kind of like comprehensively mapping out the gaps, the resources, or the opportunities that we may have in the field, and we're also trying to understand the current experiences of people around the problem that we are trying to address in the location, the two locations. So I think major question that I have is, one, whose need are we addressing in needs assessment, and how it is different from scoping study and feasibility study?
Okay, so I think the first thing that sort of needs to be answered by us is, who do we hope our programs will have an impact on, right? And in the context of Vikramshila, let's say we hope our programs will have an impact on children, right? Like, at least from what I've read about all the programs that you do, they're all centered around having an impact on children, right? So you have to, that directly sort of translates to thinking about their needs, right? Because and there may be several pathways to achieving their making sure that their needs get met, and one of them may be teacher training, where, like you're saying, there are different sets of trainings that may need to be done in order to achieve the needs of these children, right? So once you've decided who's I think it's, in this context, it's pretty clear whose needs you're thinking about. And then in terms of a scoping study, I think you're, at least from my sort of understanding of the various contexts in which a scoping study is done, you're trying to see, is there any are there any gaps here that we can fill with our skill sets, with our knowledge, with our experience, right? So you go and look at the areas that you think you have an ability to impact, and then we only look at that at the gaps in those aspects, right? So obviously you're not looking at you're possibly not looking at things like, do they have water pumps, right? Because you're scoping around the areas that you have a sense that you have the ability to impact, right? And a feasibility study typically, I think, comes from having decided to a certain extent that this is the thing I want to do. How possible is it for me to do it in this particular context, right? So if you're mandated with a particular region that you want to that you have to sort of intervene in, people, or either the donor or just because of, I don't know, where you're located, there are so many reasons that govern where we operate, right? So based on that, you may want to know, can this program actually work here? It would also depend on how many other people are doing similar things. Am I just going to be duplicating this, effort? Should I be doing something differently? And also in terms of, if I want to do it for X number of schools, what is the time resource, human resource staff that I need for this? Do I have the ability to generate, to raise all of that, to bring together all of that, right? So I think in terms of needs assessment, it's very, very tricky, like I was saying, for implementing organizations to think about it in isolation, right? You can read the text of TARL and say the identified need there was that the children's learning levels were low, right? But in the way that we operate, you often first think program design, and then we go back one step to think needs assessment. And sometimes we possibly don't even really spend too much time on thinking, is this the actual need that needs to be addressed here, right? So, which is why I think we're starting off with talking about needs assessment and what it means for people who are part of design teams, part of implementation teams, to think about in terms of what information already exists about, let's say, the area I want to operate in. What is the history of programs that have been done here? What is currently being done here? What is the sort of government's what is the government leaning towards, right? Lots of states are now leaning towards FLN things and away from other things like that. So a lot depends on what context are you operating in. And in that context, you need to identify what is the need that you may identify a need that you're not suited to address, right? So it is also important that you identify needs that you can actually address, right? So it's very, very contextual in a practical program implementation sort of process, right? Did that sort of answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Vidya. And I think read what Suraj wrote in the chat, so I think that is helpful.
Yeah.
I see that needs assessment can be a more broader area when it comes to understanding the situation and the current and the desired conditions, and scoping and feasibility. Like the explanation was really helpful, so thank you.
Yeah. Can I just also add? I think Namrata, I think you had asked a kind of a second question: whose need?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
And I think that's an interesting one to think about, because so for example, look at the quote from Banerjee et al. that we read out earlier, right? That what was it? A third grade kid can't read first grade paragraph and so on, right? So now researchers are saying this, correct?
Yeah.
Now, suppose we go to a community and they say water pump, right? And they don't say this. So then this question becomes very interesting, right? Whose need is it? Is it the researcher saying ki yahan pe nahi hai desired condition? So who desires the condition? Do we, as well-meaning non-community people, desire it for them? नहीं ये तो आप सबको learning level आपको पढ़ना चाहिए, आप पढ़ नहीं सकते. This is a very complicated one. I don't think there's a simple answer, right?
Because I kind of like this question came to my mind because you and Nelly were having a conversation, and it was it was kind of a sense that the need should be felt. It doesn't have to be felt always. There are situations, conditions when they may not feel the need, but then there is a need. And sometimes when we talk about the needs, my first need can be a different thing. My like immediate need can be a different thing than what the intervention or the implementation partner may feel.
Yeah.
Yes, but now suppose somebody in the community, right, whatever it is, that's also a complicated word, does not articulate a felt need. I think you use the term felt need, right? Let's take a very kind of tough example, domestic violence. Now, suppose the person who's a victim, typically a woman, right?
Yeah.
And the partner, some spousal abuse or some intimate partner abuse, doesn't right? That woman doesn't articulate it for whatever reason, right? What do we say? So do we say no? The Constitution becomes our or some sustainable development goals or some UN Declaration of Human Rights. We are going to go with that, right? It becomes very tricky, right? Just because that woman is not articulating it, what happens? Yeah, is really, yeah. I think Atanu also felt induced. This becomes tricky. So I think we can, and it's a matter of interpretation, right? Who speaks for who? Who speaks for the community? Does the Patel of the community speak? Does the Sarpanch speak? Who knows, right?
And
right? So
also there might be an example where you can go and you can say that this is what the community needs, but then community doesn't think or community doesn't actually need it. So
and suppose community is articulating some need that we find problematic, right? I read somewhere in Haryana, some panchayat, declared that some anti-Muslim thing, that we will not do any business with Muslims, right? Some panchayat declared this, right? That's their felt, I don't know, need, it seems, right? Now, so this becomes very hard. I think it is really about values and conflicts of values and who speaks for who and whose values. And it's a tough one. So I'm just appreciate Namrata bringing it up. I don't think there is a clear answer.
I mean, and also I think in our world, that I mean, in this restricted world of the people who are on this call, children hardly ever are allowed to articulate their own needs, or their articulation of their own needs is very rarely taken seriously by any of us, right? So yeah, so in that case, I think there is some balance between what is the social just need that that needs to be delivered, and what is the articulated need as such. So yeah, I think the next
To
slide.
complicate it further, in the Marxists used to use this term, which is like a little out of fashion now, false consciousness.
Yeah.
These workers are not organizing because they have, there's a lot of, and feminists also sometimes use this term for why women are, in particular, whatever situations and so on. It's quite complicated, right? Because then we are saying who's to take that decision on who's false conscious, right?
one example is the ban the burqa sort of a thing which France came up with, right? Which is like the government telling women how they feel they should be liberated. And women's responses were completely, they were all over the spectrum.
So coming back to the need assessment, I have another question. So what is the initial point for a needs assessment then? What is the context for that?
What do you mean initial point?
What?
Sorry, what do you mean initial point? Are you saying what is the starting point
Like
of a needs
the
assessment?
starting point of a needs assessment. Yeah.
I think in my head, the first thing that we need to do is to identify, I mean, to articulate to ourselves, what do we want to get out of this needs assessment, right? That would be the first thing to do, right? So we need to be very, very clear on what is the objective of this needs assessment exercise for us, for the organization. And then once that is clear, I think you can start thinking about how you want to go about collecting this information, right? Who do you want to talk to? What sources of information do you want to use? What literature do you want to read? All of that. But what, at the end of this needs assessment exercise, what do you hope to have learned, right? I think articulating the objective of a needs assessment exercise is very important. As is often the case, we tend to do a needs assessment exercise in a very routine sort of manner, or it gets written up in proposals, at least in my experience, it gets written up in proposals as something that we already know, right? And we need to, I think, do it with a bit more rigor so that we can be sure that this need is actually still exists, you know. So I think the objective, I mean, articulating to ourselves why we want to do a needs assessment and what do we hope we have at the end of this needs assessment exercise it would be the first step in my opinion.
So, Dipti, one thing in my mind is regarding the trial, actually, trial. That is the ASAR report that they
Correct.
see, see that there is a gap between the learning outcomes that they
Right.
expecting.
Correct.
So, from that ASAR report, they are expecting some need of some
Correct.
intervention in the school system or any other
Right.
thing.
Right.
From that actually that report, they are taking the decision that they feel the need actually. Is it correct? I am assuming like that. Is it? I am in the right way. That's what I want to ask.
No, that's exactly the approach that they took, right? So the ASAR study happens every year, and it tells you what the learning level, broadly tells you what the learning levels of the children are in various states. You can go down to district level, things like that. So that report was used as the source of, as one of the sources of information to identify what the need of this particular set of schools or the set of children could be. Yes, that's exactly what was done there. Yeah. And if that is the ideal approach, if that was your question, it's one of the approaches, is looking at what literature already exists, what information already exists, what is the previous knowledge about this of this community that already exists, right? So it's one of the many ways in which you can gather information about what the need of whoever you want to work with, what their need is. Yeah, it's one of the sources of information. I think we're we're over time, right? So I really don't want to hold people back anymore.
Yeah, Dvitya, we are over time, and some people really have to travel
No,
quite a
absolutely.
bit from the office.
Understand. So I think what we'll do is, it has started, I think, a useful conversation in a direction of, what needs assessment is, and clearly there is no easy answer here. So I think it would help if we could all just think about any way in which you've been involved in a needs assessment exercise, or any process, right? A feasibility study, a scoping, in any way that you were trying to identify communities' needs. And if you could just think about it over the next week and bring those experiences to share with us in the starting of the next session, then we can pick it up from there, from what your experience has been, and and how we can possibly think about, do we need to add anything to how we do this, right? Yeah, I don't think the other thing that I wanted to bring up, which is in my very teacher format, is we've not had too many submissions of assignments from the last week, right? And this is now a course that's going to be looked at for certification. What the rigor with which we're doing this is going to be looked at. So now that we've spoken about this, Suraj has taken us through these questions in far more detail. It would help if everyone can take a shot at sort of attempting to answer these questions from the TAL literature that we have so far, right? Would that
As in
be okay?
the old homework as well.
Yeah, only the old homework. I think there's
We
only
are not getting any new homework, right?
no, other than thinking about some needs assessment exercise that you've been a part of, there is no new homework. But I think it'd be really helpful if more people can take a shot at the old homework. Right? I think that's it. So we're due to meet next week again. So yeah, yes. I think she was the first one to submit as well. So yeah, so yeah, it would help.
Where are we supposed to submit?
There's a link that Naini shared actually, a Google Drive link.
Okay.
Where you can
Maybe I'll
upload
again
your
share it.
Yeah, no, I have the link. In fact, we were all discussing because, Naini actually began the conversation for today with the same topic that, most of the questions we were not able to link it to the information that was shared.
Correct.
So that
But
was the
now I
reason. But
think
now
it's easier, no?
we have much more clarity.
It would help if we can
Yeah.
take it off. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. Anything else with it? Okay
Yeah.
then. So
And to the extent possible, we'll try to sort of not take topics over sessions, where possible. I think this time it will have to spill over.
yeah.
Sometimes it will, but yeah, hopefully people are okay with that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Suraj. Thank
Yeah.
you, Dvitya.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you next week.
Bye. Yeah.
Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.